I would also like to welcome Mr. Don Spinks, AM, and Bob Garrity, University Librarian. Return explored the process of repatriation and its impact on Australian society until 1929, following the journey of veterans as they were prepared for repatriation by Sir John Monash and their struggles and successes at reintegrating. On the eve of Remembrance Day, and at a time in society when mental health resources have been taxed anew, we feel that it is worthwhile to consider in more depth the legacy of the First World War, especially the long shadows that war-related trauma have had on the treatment of mental health of veterans and its impact on wider Australian society. I'd now like to hand over to our facilitator, Dr. Anne Holloway, Manager of Special Collections, Monash University Library.
Sorry, everybody. Greetings and welcome. I have the great pleasure of welcoming here Effie today, who is giving our paper. She is a historian based at the University of Newcastle, and her research is in the social history of war, specifically histories of gender and mental health. After the beginning of the exhibition Return, in which much of the research on the section of PTSD was based off her research, it gives me nothing but pleasure to actually have her here to talk today. So rather than me going on, I'm going to hand it over to Effie and she can tell you everything.
Thank you so much. I'll just quickly share my screen. Give me 2 seconds. Okay. Thanks so much, Anne, and thanks to the Monash University Library for having me. I just want to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Pambalong clan of the Awabakal people, and that sovereignty was never ceded, and pay respects for elders past and present. I also want to give a little bit of a content warning for this lecture. I am going to talk about suicide during this lecture. Okay, so I'll start. When called to aid the British in 1914, Australian authorities responded dutifully. An unprecedented number of young Australian men enlisted for service in the First World War. One that saw the technological capabilities of weaponry reach levels that transformed the nature of combat, causing many to be sent home with not only physical, but also psychological wounds. The First World War is known for introducing shell shock, one of several psychiatric conditions that afflicted soldiers during and after the conflict. From 1914, the Royal Army Medical Corps began sending British soldiers home with shell shock. Australia is significantly less advanced in the field of psychiatry, and particularly military psychiatry, than the United States and other European nations more experienced in warfare, didn't send men home with shell shock until 1916. So the question arises, why such a lengthy delay? And was this particular to the First World War? So in this lecture, I'm going to explore the relationship between the Australian military forces and trauma. I'm going to expand on popular understandings of the First World War and shell shock to contextualize their psychiatric impact. Ideas about both martial masculinity and mental health that emerged in the late 19th century decidedly influenced the consideration of traumatized Australian Imperial Force soldiers from 1914. The British historian Fiona Reid writes that although the severity of shell shock caused British military medical authorities to consider it a new affliction, its symptoms matched mental illness observed among soldiers and civilians before 1914. The unprecedented technological strength of the war had merely escalated its prevalence and intensity. Viewing military psychiatry as an evolving practice then allows us to see parallels between ideas about trauma and masculinity between the late 19th century and the First World War, and specifically the first conflict that Australia fought as a nation from 1899 to 1902, which was the South African War. It also helps us see how these ideas have endured throughout later major 20th century wars, each of which introduced new psychiatric challenges for soldiers and for military medical authorities. So a few things to consider before we start this discussion. Medical terminology has markedly shifted since the late 19th century. Terms such as trauma, psychology, and psychiatry did not mean the same thing then that they mean now. For example, most early 20th century physicians believed that mental illness was caused by physical processes within the body, which we'll see when we talk about the first consideration of shell shock. As a result, it's difficult to retrospectively diagnose historical actors, due both to the frequent vagueness of psychiatric disorders or diagnoses in the past, and the fact that psychiatry was categorically rejected by many physicians in the first decades of the 20th century. How can we really know what these doctors were observing or diagnosing? What cultural expectations did they have in their minds when they were diagnosing these soldiers? Reflexivity is a key consideration for historians of psychiatry, in particular for that reason. We need to be aware of our influence and the influence of the time in which we're writing on what we study and write. So I'm going to use these modern day terms that refer to aspects of mental health with this awareness. We can't be definite about past diagnoses. But the aim of the history of psychiatry, or military psychiatry, which is the case here, is not to figure out what conditions soldiers were actually suffering from. The aim is to analyse how doctors diagnose them or describe their symptoms, how doctors basically saw soldiers, because that tells us about society and psychiatry at that specific time. I often refer to the consideration of war trauma during the First World War as a mess, and it was. It wasn't a neat and tidy story of shell shock discovery, diagnosis, and development of treatment. There were disagreements within militaries and medical practitioners from all nations participating in the war about what constituted shell shock, whether shell shock existed, whether malingering soldiers were faking shell shock symptoms to escape the battlefield, and the best way to treat the condition. Also, shell shock wasn't the only psychiatric condition soldiers were diagnosed with during the conflict. There was also neurasthenia, disordered action of the heart, effort syndrome, among others. The good news is that all of this led to notable advances in the field of psychiatry, particularly psychoanalysis. And in Australia, this was led by the notable Melbourne psychiatrist and former asylum superintendent who served in the First World War, John Springthorpe. But sadly, few soldiers were able to really reap the benefits of this advancement. So if we're speaking statistically, around 2,200 soldiers were diagnosed with shell shock on the battlefield, Australian soldiers. Others were diagnosed with disordered action of the heart, neurasthenia, psychosis, effort syndrome, among others. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about neurasthenia and disordered action of the heart a little later. But these statistics don't tell us as much as we'd like. They don't consider the diagnostic uncertainty or lack of psychiatric acceptance among Australian physicians serving on the front, Springthorpe being a notable exception. They also don't consider the reluctance of those doctors aware of the stigma in Australian society towards the mentally ill to diagnose men with nervous conditions. And they also don't count the many soldiers who developed traumatic conditions after the war, many of whom did not seek treatment, fearing stigma or not recognising the signs of mental illness, or those who were not eligible for treatment, including Indigenous soldiers. The story of trauma during the First World War is broader than shell shock and broader than the period 1914 to 1918. The return home of traumatised soldiers brought war-related psychiatric conditions into Australian communities, leading to the formation of a continuously changing cultural understanding of shell shock, distinct from its medical understanding. This has lasted until today, albeit in different forms. Public conceptualization of war trauma was influenced by ideas already circulating in society about war, mental health, and masculinity, ideas that can be traced back to the late 19th century, Federation of the 1st of January 1901, which saw the union of the Australian colonies, and when Australian soldiers were in South Africa fighting the Boer forces. So let's start with the First World War and the appearance of shell shock. When soldiers began exhibiting signs of shell shock in 1914, with symptoms ranging from what looked like depression or fear to more severe symptoms such as mutism or the inability to walk or move, British medical authorities thought it was caused by the effects of shells exploding in close proximity to stricken soldiers. Its discovery led to a focused debate between medical practitioners who considered shell shock, or indeed any psychiatric condition, a physical ailment, and others who insisted on its psychological origin. These debates were largely silenced by London Dr. Harold Wiltshire in June 1916, who examined shell shock victims on the battlefield and insisted that most soldiers he inspected had not been near an exploding shell, instead pointing to psychic or psychological causes. It needs to be noted as well, even now, war trauma is known, it doesn't just come from combat service. It can come even if a soldier has not seen combat at all. But many maintained that shell shock had physical causes, including Arthur Butler, who was the author of the 3-volume Official History of the Australian Army Medical Services in the War of 1914 to 1918, which you can see in that image. That was published between 1930 and 1943. And his beliefs influenced Australian public memory of the conflict, including ideas about war trauma. Many prominent European physicians treating shell-shocked soldiers during the First World War believed that the most efficient way to treat men who had lost the ability to speak was to apply electricity, sometimes using it to an extent that would be considered inhumane today. This is connected to the prominent idea among both many doctors and the military authorities that shell shock was evidence of malingering by soldiers or the refusal to continue to fight. The French doctor, Dr Claude Vincent, in particular advocated torpedoing mentally wounded soldiers by administering, quote, a combination of electricity and vigorous persuasion to reawaken his sense of patriotism and masculine self-respect. The suggestion here that symptoms of psychological trauma were not synonymous with masculinity or self-respect is significant in terms of ideas existing within Australia at that time about the inconceivability of the male insane soldier. It also reveals the ways mentally wounded soldiers were judged or doubted, which continued after the war. In the 1922 British report of the War Office Committee of Inquiry into Shell Shock, military historian John Fortescue claimed that the words of, quote, private soldiers in particular are always to be regarded with suspicion, end quote. But he still acknowledged that there were men who broke down in every campaign. The skepticism and ambiguity in Fortescue's statement reflects official attitudes in Australia towards shell shock in the post-war years, which may have dissuaded men from reporting their own psychological symptoms for fear they be branded malingerers themselves when applying for a pension. The fact that psychological trauma can be exhibited in physical ways, including headaches, amnesia, eczema, arthritis, and back pain, only served to increase official and public confusion and thus place traumatized soldiers in a vulnerable position. Many traumatized First World War soldiers did not develop observable symptoms until after they returned home, and they were required to face masculine and psychiatric expectations that they were often unable to fulfill. Many found it difficult to reconcile the demands on their manhood as soldiers with their re-entry into society. After the conflict, the Australian psychiatrist Reg Ellery claimed that the simple requirement to demonstrate heightened aggressive masculinity in war and then repress it to readapt to civilian life caused mental illness among many ex-servicemen. The historian Marina Larson says that shell-shocked Australians returning from the First World War were seen as, in her words, the antithesis of masculinity, not able to succeed as Anzacs, nor as domestic male breadwinners upon their return. So in an environment that places such high expectations on men, and particularly ex-servicemen, those who do not exhibit masculinity can be perceived in feminized terms. When soldiers have been elevated to the role of national heroes, possessing a distinct form of ultra-masculinity, traumatized ex-servicemen are by necessity marginalized. This was emphasized during and after the First World War, an event that was viewed by military and political authorities as an ideal site to blood the Australian nation. The Australian Army Medical Corps during the First World War were aware of the stigmatisation of traumatised ex-servicemen, writing sick or debility on their medical records to avoid stigmatising individual soldiers or the entire Australian Imperial Force. I should note that debility was, in the South African War and the First World War, often used as a condition because there was so much uncertainty about psychological trauma. It was often used as a, oh, well, I'm not really sure what this is. I'm going to put debility. It meant weakness in some way by many doctors. Again, it's very hard to pinpoint it completely. But as mentioned earlier, the application of these ideals onto soldiers can also be traced back to the South African War of 1899 to 1902, between the British and Boer republics, the first conflict fought by the United Australian nation. that was formed through federation on the 1st of January 1901. And this was halfway through the conflict, almost exactly halfway through the conflict. The construction of the Australian male and the mentally ill citizen from this period applied to the men who became traumatised during or after their military service in South Africa is an important consideration in the understanding of men fighting a little over a decade later in the First World War. So what did the ideal male look like during the Federation era? The Federation movement largely espoused a figure who was dignified, earnest and Protestant, according to John Hurst, a middle-class figure. But working-class social and masculine nationalism of the time, revered by poets such as Banjo Paterson and Henry Lawson, became more popular among the Australian public. Their urban individualism and rejection of British middle-class male domesticity led to the idealisation of a rural, working-class and mobile mode of masculinity, representing the literal bushworker. Russell Ward claimed in his book, The Australian Legend in the 1960s, that the appropriation of the bushman, the rural proletariat, in his words, who was masculine in outlook and disposition, was a romantic notion. Still, the legacy of the bushman continued. Many men who volunteered to fight in the South African War were bushmen, rural workers who volunteered as a reaction to widespread drought and subsequent unemployment in the decade before the war. If you look at their attestment records, you can see the bush-based employment. The centrality of the male citizen in the bushman ideal naturally served to exclude females. It also excluded the mentally ill male who could not fulfill the masculine ideal within a society that linked madness with weakness and thus femininity. Soldiers fighting in South Africa as representatives of the burgeoning Australian nation could not conceivably be included in those groups. This is demonstrated by the words of James Hume Cook, member for the former Victorian electorate of Burke, who said on the 31st of July 1901, so less than a year before the end of the war, he said in the Federal House of Representatives that a cadet movement was necessary to develop a healthy manhood in Australia, which he argued was necessary due to the, quote, great increase in the number of children suffering from nervous disorders, end quote. The cadetship was instituted in 1911, but Hume Cook's separation of manhood and nervous disorders is significant here. The bushman model of masculinity was certainly applied to the troops that volunteered for service in South Africa, seen initially by the existence of specifically named bushman contingents. Parliamentarians were aware of the value of bushmen as combatants, particularly when facing Boer guerrilla fighting in the second half of the war. Alan McLean, member for Gippsland and former Premier of Victoria, said on the 14th of January 1902, quote, the nature of the conflict is such as to render Australian bushmen especially suitable. The Australian bushman is the equal of the Boer in horsemanship, in marksmanship and in bushcraft. His aid is invaluable to the mother country, end quote. Although the middle-class figures who led the Federation movement favoured a more systematic white Australian masculinity over the bushman ideal, in military terms, the bushman prevailed. During the First World War, the bushman archetype was transformed into the cult of the superior soldier, who exhibited similar virtues to the hardy colonial. The myth created around Australian First World War soldiers, according to Mark Sheftel, reflected larger and long-standing notions about the nature of the societies taking shape in the Empire's white dominions. The war's official historian Charles Bean supported this view, directly relating the perceived superiority of Australian soldiers with the egalitarian bush tradition. In the absence of a long-term military tradition before the First World War, conceptions of masculinity related to the bushman continued to define the Australian man in the post-war years. As the historian Marilyn Lake writes, the Great War transformed the bushman as a cultural hero into the new national hero, the Digger or Anzac. After the war, he had his status as soldier officially connected to his citizenship so as to reinforce the nationalist ideal. So what of psychiatry between these wars? From the end of the South African War in 1902 until the First World War began in 1914, there was little advancement in the actual treatment of mental illness within Australia. In later wars, so First World War, Second World War, and Vietnam, responses to war trauma on the battlefield reverberated in civilian psychiatry, especially as many civilian psychiatrists worked on the battlefield. But during the South African War, there was no discernible conception yet within Australia that war and mental illness was connected. Britain had an established military mental hospital by the time of the South African War, but Australia was significantly delayed in this matter. In pre-World War Australia, medical practitioners working with the insane were still advocating bed rest as the best form of treatment as late as 1911. Even John Springthorpe, who was arguably Australia's most advanced early 20th century psychiatrist, didn't engage with military psychiatry until the First World War, when he served as a medical officer on the battlefield and began applying psychoanalytic approaches to mental illness, which had proved successful in the treatment of European shell-shocked soldiers. But he encountered significant barriers to his developments on the battlefield, as most Australian physicians at this time saw mentally ill patients, and particularly soldiers, as morally depraved, willful, or egoistic. These continuing ideas about masculinity between Federation and the First World War certainly affected the consideration of traumatized men from the South African War. Also, similar psychiatric ideas that informed many Australian physicians during the South African War informed them during the First World War. For example, civilian doctors used electricity to treat what appeared to be traumatic conditions. Peter Leese's words that psychiatric conditions, including shell shock, appeared as, quote, illness without a lesion, unquote, was significant when considering a large body of physicians who were very focused on physical processes within the body when considering mental illness. So I'm going to look more closely at two psychiatric conditions that existed during both periods, neurasthenia and disordered action of the heart. And that's going to help us see the delays in military psychiatry practice more closely during the South African War, when Australian military and medical authorities rarely acknowledged a connection between combat and psychological trauma. And this is going to help us see how these cultural ideas about masculinity and mental health affected diagnoses of these traumatized men. And then it helps us understand why similar delays occurred during the First World War and other major conflicts of the 20th century. So it's that idea that cultural expectations of the men affected their diagnoses, or the way that doctors saw them or diagnosed them. So disordered action of the heart first. It's a psychiatric condition characterized by the weak but rapid beating of the heart with breathlessness, poor concentration and exhaustion. It was first labelled DAH in 1899, but its symptoms match those of irritable heart in the American Civil War and palpitation in the Crimean War. From the First World War, DAH, so I'll call it DAH, that was the shortening that was called, the abbreviation that was used then, was officially recognised as a psychological ailment, and 1,433 Australian soldiers were diagnosed with DAH during the First World War. During the South African War, it was largely considered a physical condition attributed to a local malnutrition and cardiovascular failure, which caused nervous symptoms. And this was among the British. So this is from the British Medical History of the War. Interestingly, the British medical historian of the South African War, Simpson, wrote in 1911 that DAH was similar to neurasthenia, which at that time was an established nervous condition. He wrote that some officers suffering from neurasthenia were diagnosed with DAH. The British Medical History of the War found that 3,631 soldiers and 28 officers were diagnosed with DAH in South Africa, and 199 British soldiers were granted pensions for DAH. Within the Australian contingents, however, very few heart conditions appear, most commonly labelled palpitation or dilated heart associated with mental enfeeblement. So I have to note that when I was going through all of the archives, there were soldiers that had just heart issues. Those ones, there had to be a sort of nervous symptom also described for me to think, okay, well, they're seeing evidence of trauma here. There were other soldiers that had heart issues that I couldn't interpret as being traumatic, because I couldn't see anything there that gave me an indication. The only mention of DAH among the Australian contingents is treated with suspicion, despite the fact that Australian and British medical officers frequently worked in the same hospitals in South Africa, and Australian military medical staff elicited praise from British authorities impressed with its level of medical care and hygiene. So Australian physicians were likely aware of DAH during the South African War. In the First World War, as I said earlier, 1,433 Australian soldiers were diagnosed with DAH. So I'm going to give a couple of examples. Angus N was a bush labourer according to his enlistment forms, who enlisted in the New South Wales Citizen Bushman to go to South Africa on the 14th of February 1900, and by June was suffering general debility, dilated heart, and mental enfeeblement. He applied for a war pension, and an Australian medical assessment found that his condition was the result of service. It's very rare in these cases, caused by drinking water consumed in South Africa. Similarly, on the 12th of June 1901, Dealman S of the 5th Queensland contingent was hospitalised in South Africa with cold shivers and vomiting, and then and then sent back to Brisbane on the 9th of November. 3 days later, military medical staff found his only symptom was heart irregularity and palpitation and nervousness. And then in the New South Wales Pension Board's minutes, other cases of heart disease that are connected with trauma do appear. The only reference to DAH in available Australian archives appears in an application to the Patriotic Fund of Queensland by a man called William A, who fought in the 6th Queensland Imperial Bushman. He returned from South Africa in June 1902 with, in his words, so on his application, he wrote this, disorderly action of the heart and affected lung. And on the 28th of July, he appealed to the Patriotic Fund on the basis of unemployment. The fund requested medical evidence, and this medical evidence, the doctor wrote, his heart is irritable and his action is very rapid, but then ambiguously added, I have every reason to believe that this is a bona fide case. At the same time, it is my duty to point out that the palpitation from which he suffers and the disordered action of the heart can be self-induced by nibbling cordite, and in suspicious cases, it is well to have the men under careful observation in a hospital. The use of cordite in South Africa has received little attention in the literature, with the exception of the South African Medical History of the Conflict by Kay de Villiers. But it was discussed within Simpson's British Medical History. Cordite is better known for its use by First World War soldiers attempting to escape the battlefield. The medical evidence provided appears to be in line with many British doctors who were also suspicious of malingerers from the South African War applying for pensions or charity. And that again demonstrates a connection between attitudes towards trauma in the two conflicts. But this does confirm that William was genuinely suffering from heart palpitations, whether he genuinely had a psychiatric condition or not, and it led to the fund granting him 20 shillings per week for 3 months. It is possible to attribute the lack of Australian attention to DAH to lack of medical knowledge and scant archives, but 3,659 British soldiers were diagnosed with DAH during the South African War. Many soldiers personified the Bushman ideal as rural workers and believed in their superiority as Australians. In the soldiers' letters and diaries from the battlefield, there are numerous references to the bush qualities of the troops as superior to the British. For example, Private Robert J. Byers of the 1st Victorian Contingent wrote home to his mother, the Boers reckoned they would rather meet 100 Tommies, the British soldiers, than 20 Australians. One wanted to know why the Horstralians were called Horstralians, and the only conclusion they could come to was that it was because they were also used to horses. Private Watson Augustus Steele also wrote from military hospital. The nurse rated me and told me that I was soon to die. On telling her I was an Australian, I think she altered her opinion. I have so many similar excerpts from soldiers' letters and diaries from this war. They're fascinating. Corporal J.H.M. Abbott of the 1st Australian Horse wrote, place the average bushbred boy of 18 beside the same English lad and note the difference. In the exercise of what we term bushmanship, until they, Englishmen, have learnt by bitterly bought experience, they are forever wanting. Similarly, Charles Bean wrote, when an Englishman comes out as a labourer, he does not think he is signing on for active service. Short of putting a man up and running a piece of iron through him, there is probably nothing more like real warfare in the world. It's really interesting how he's comparing bush work with warfare here. So the cultural construction of both the soldier and the insane male suggests that mental illness may have been difficult to accept in these men, particularly among doctors whose public statements and publications during the conflict repeated jingoistic ideas in the British and Australian press and were reluctant to acknowledge psychological symptoms. And then we can see how that moved on to the First World War. So apologies, for some reason this isn't changing, here it is. Comparing the consideration of neurasthenia with DAH demonstrates the link between masculinity and trauma. So neurasthenia existed within the evident boundaries of military and medical acceptability during both the South African War and the First World War, due to its provenance as a masculine affliction. Neurasthenia was a working man's disease, identified by the American George Beard in 1869 as a nervous illness arising from railways and other modern technologies. This connection became significant in terms of its similarity to war-related psychiatric disorders, making neurasthenia a specifically masculine diagnosis, separated from the traditionally female hysteria and melancholia. The historian Janet Oppenheim labels neurasthenia a far more respectable affliction for British men that was more likely to be attached to traumatised officers during the First World War, so as to convey respectability in comparison with rank and file soldiers, who often were more likely to be labelled hysterics, which is a more feminine label culturally. During the South African War, neurasthenia was the only specifically nervous illness connected to military service attributed to Australian soldiers, with the exception of DAH, but it must be noted that DAH wasn't considered nervous. It was just shown that it was physical and it caused nervous symptoms. Neurasthenia was, this is presumably due to neurasthenia's established link with respectability and hard work, which were distinctly masculine attributes. So, for example, Queensland privates John F. and A.M. were sent home in late 1901 and early 1902, respectively, with neurasthenia. Private George R. of the 2nd Scottish Horse and the 6th Australian Commonwealth Horse was diagnosed with neurasthenia arising from military service after being admitted to the Melbourne Hospital on the 7th of March 1908, 6 years after the war, after complaining of stomach problems, which is another currently listed symptom of psychological trauma from war. The acceptance of neurasthenia as a sufficiently masculine condition connected with white workers meant that it could be attached to soldiers with minimal social repercussions. And this continued into the First World War. 545 men were diagnosed with neurasthenia. In viewing military psychiatry as a continually developing practice then, an important connection can be made between the South African and First World Wars. The years 1914 to 1918 was certainly a catalyst for the study and practice of military psychiatry in Australia and changed the attitudes of many physicians towards the study of the mind. But the occurrence of combat-related psychiatric disorders among Australians fighting in the South African War and perceptions of mental illness shaping the medical treatment of these men can be linked with the delays associated with First World War military psychiatry. And these attitudes, didn't disappear at the end of the First World War and with the commencement of the Second World War. And they affected the eligibility of many soldiers for pensions under the Repatriation Act instituted in 1917. While shell shock and associated conditions were officially included in pension legislation, psychiatric conditions were largely invisible, illness without a lesion, in Peter Leese's words. And this added to the widespread scepticism among physicians, including military medical authorities, and concern about malingering. In 1919, the AIF medical records were also destroyed in London, which increased the difficulty of men applying for pensions after the war, proving a connection between their medical conditions and combat. Men who could not avoid facing their trauma due to the severity of their symptoms were subject to frequently harsh assessments by pension authorities. The families of those unable to advocate for themselves fought bitterly to avoid the stigma of mental illness by insisting on institutionalization in specific military medical hospitals. Mental hospitals, not medical, no, obviously medical, instead of civilian facilities. Traumatized men who remained at home, perhaps masking their symptoms and medical conditions in accordance with the traditional stiff upper lip, were frequently cared for by family members, which impacted the lives of wives, mothers, and children by causing sorrow and grief, and at times domestic violence or the effects of alcoholism, thus broadening the overall consequences of trauma and war. Indigenous soldiers were ineligible for pensions despite having fought for Australia during the First World War. And so any trauma that arose within Indigenous communities as a result of the war could not be treated or compensated by the Australian nation. As psychiatric knowledge increased then, did the situation change for soldiers? So in the last portion of this lecture, I'm going to talk about conflict since the First World War. The enduring national mythology surrounding the First World War Anzac persisted through the overseas military engagements of the 20th century till today, in fact. And this affected the experiences of men who have been psychologically wounded during war service. So the Second World War saw political and military authorities promoting a virtually unchanged masculine ideal in public representations of Australian soldiers. More women entered the workforce during the war, which saw around 500,000 men travel overseas to fight. When these men returned to Australia, they found that these working women were unwilling to return to the pre-war level of gender imbalance, leading to a widespread crisis of readjustment. This issue was exacerbated by the incidence and intensity of combat breakdown during the war, significantly more devastating than in the First World War. And you would think that then the Australian military would be prepared because of the First World War, but sadly there was not as much attention as there needed to be on the incidence of traumatic neurosis or war trauma during the Second World War. Advanced military technology brought new ways to kill and a higher rate of psychiatric casualties of war, which was often labelled traumatic neurosis. Within the United States military, 50% of soldiers suffered mental collapse and couldn't continue fighting. And after 30 days on the battlefield, 98% were displaying signs of psychological trauma. Men were reluctant to disclose neurotic symptoms, and medical officers to diagnose them with the psychological condition. It was not until February 1945, the last year of the war, that a specific Australian Army Psychology Service was established, again later than similar British and American developments. The Vietnam War served as a turning point in many ways in the recognition of trauma among soldiers and veterans. Public responses to the conflict created a renewed crisis of masculinity, when many soldiers returned home from the battlefield to find that widespread opposition to the conflict had relegated them, along with the Anzac legend, to a subordinate and demasculinized position within the nation. When I was researching for my PhD and then later my book, there were so many cases in soldiers' letters and diaries of them mentioning what they were expecting when they got home. The conflict resulted in the first recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which was included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 3 of 1918. This was very significant. It doesn't mean that stigma associated with war trauma disappeared, but it moved towards systematizing the condition, which theoretically should have made the process of compensation simpler for soldiers. But the stigma of mental illness persisted, and Australia continued to lag behind in the consideration of war trauma. For example, American studies of combat breakdown were published from the years of the war, but Australian studies did not begin to appear until after DSM-3 was published. And even now, one of the most valuable studies of Vietnam War soldiers is by Peter Bourne, an American who wrote Men's Stress in Vietnam and has a chapter specifically on Australian soldiers. And that was published in 1970 during the war. The Gulf War of 1990 to 1991 ended a year before the Keating government introduced changes to the Australian Defence Force that began to abandon early 20th century conceptions of martial masculinity, allowing women into combat units and lifting the LGB ban. So this broadened the gender definition of the Australian soldier. The emergence of Gulf War syndrome, which was a seemingly new psychiatric condition, saw the Australian government commission the first report into the mental health of ex-servicemen in a single theatre of war. This was released some years after Britain and the United States had published their own reports. Sadly, during the 20th century, these types of delays frequently categorize the general military response to issues related to combat breakdown in Australia. But that's changing in the 21st century. The military has been identified as a primary location for the establishment and continuation of multiple hegemonic or typical masculinities that constantly adapt to shifting priorities through institutional power, political power. In Australia, many are outgrowing the martial and masculine tropes of the early 20th century as their values and beliefs organically shift in response to large-scale changes such as liberation of women, multiculturalism, and the visibility of Indigenous issues. The Australian Defence Force has taken significant steps to challenging past perceptions of the soldier by officially adopting a policy of inclusiveness. The 2010 ADF Mental Health Prevalence and Wellbeing Study, along with adoption of its suggested policy adjustments, demonstrate that it's also seeking to address mental health issues. But societal stigma still exists, and it means that many veterans do not seek help for mental health issues, directly contributing to the high suicide rates among Australian veterans of more recent wars. And this has turned into a crisis in recent years, culminating in the appointment of a National Commissioner for Defence and Suicide Prevention by the Australian Federal Government in February 2020. And they've put together a provisional report already. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare found in their 2017 study of veterans that 51% of the 325 servicemen and women who took their lives between 2001 and 2016 did so after re-entering civilian society. Since the early 1990s, and particularly following the election of John Howard as Prime Minister in 1996, there has been an intense reorientation of national identity back to its martial and masculine origins, and a re-emphasis of the importance of the Anzac legend, which has had an impact on the way many Australians see the nation or how many soldiers see themselves. So to conclude, war trauma has existed as long as conflict has occurred. However, there can be severe consequences for traumatized soldiers impacted by cultural expectations, which in the recent past have changed more than ever, with the 1992 inclusion of women in combat roles and 2010 inclusion of transgender soldiers. This lecture has demonstrated that the relationship between gender and war trauma in Australia can be traced from the late 19th century or the Federation era and the fighting of the South African War through to today. While gendered expectations on soldiers and veterans have not determined the medical course of war trauma, it has affected political, military, psychiatric, and public responses to trauma. The stigma associated with trauma and thus the willingness or ability for traumatized ex-servicemen to seek help for war-related mental health issues over the 20th century and 21st century. This has impacted the lives not only of combat soldiers, but also their families, friends, and communities who often take a primary role in post-war care. Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing my screen.
And I shall start sharing and staring at my screen again. Thank you so much, Effie. That was really wonderful. I have lots of questions, but I also wanted to remind everybody that for the last, say, 15 minutes, we do have time to take questions for everybody within the webinar. So feel free to put them in. We're paying attention and we can start answering them as you put them in. So just a second, I'm just going to get them to show up. You'll have to bear with me. So while people are gathering their thoughts, because there was a lot of coverage and a lot of information in that paper, I wanted to ask you, Effie, just really, well, actually not really quickly, because I'm quite fascinated by the sort of the relationship or the building of not just the concept of Australian masculinity, but the way it's worked into the Anzac legend as well, which is not just constructed in the 90s to the 2000s, but also was part of like the discourse across the 20s. So you had described that those who are showing symptoms of nervousness or neurasthenia, or what we now call PTSD, as morally depraved and egoistic, which is kind of the exact opposite of the idea of Anzac and mateship. Was there any change in, I guess what I'm asking is, did the physical symptoms and the psychiatric symptoms affect the development of the idea of mateship and how it was constructed?
So whether the psychiatric symptoms in the South African War and First World War and onwards affected the way that affected martial masculinity, had an effect on how martial masculinity was constructed. Well,
thank you for reframing that.
No. I needed to understand it because I'm reading all these amazing questions on the side and I thought, so it usually went the other way round to the detriment of the soldiers. I often, when I'm talking about this and I'm reading about soldiers, I just sort of turn and just think, oh, those poor guys, because it's not really in a country's interest for men who are sent off to fight wars to be seen in these feminized or demasculinized terms that are associated with psychological trauma. So there was this real attempt to sort of separate it. And I know that during the Second World War, just surprisingly, and I want to note that Second World War, Korean War, Vietnam War and Gulf War, there hasn't been that much research on this specific issue, which is my next planned project. So this is sort of initial research by me. But the Second World War, you would think that after what happened with shell shock, there would be, they would be ready to go. The United States was ready to go. They instituted psychiatric tests quite early, but Australia not so. And then when Vietnam went on, I was reading recently that during Vietnam, there was just like this thought throughout the military that there was no real association between combat and trauma. And I was just reading it, just going, how on earth could you have this expectation? So you can see that the martial masculinity side was really sort of pushed. And it seems to be the case now in those reports that I spoke about, that there's still this idea that soldiers, male soldiers particularly, and female too, transgender too, have to be a certain way. And that's an issue, I think.
Yes, sorry, finding the mute button. I believe you have a question there from Christina Spittle, if you'd like to answer that one.
Oh, which one? Sorry, there's a few here.
Yeah, answer away.
The one from the first one from Mary. There's one from Bronwyn. Yep. Bronwyn.
So just work your way through them, I think.
I will work my way through them. Yes, why did the period covering John Howard lead to more masculinity? John Howard doesn't strike me as someone who's macho. No, me neither. The way that I see it is war, sending mass people off to war is not as popular as it used to be. And so if you want to fight wars alongside the US, we fight wars alongside the US now, and you want to continue to have people enlisting or volunteering or joining the military forces, it sort of is to your advantage to sort of advertise things in that way. But that's not the only reason. Australia doesn't have a long military tradition. It's not like Britain, it's not like Europe, it's not like the United States. It really started in the 19th century, and only then it was quite sort of, bits and pieces here. We sent, New South Wales sent some men to the Sudan in 1885. They didn't see fighting, they got there too late, etc. So there's this real need to show strength, and there's still that association between military activities and strength. So can you sort of see the connections there? So pushing forward this idea that harks back to this time of glorious warfare, but it seems to be doing negative things to the soldiers who are fighting, coming back to a society that's so different. I hope that answered the question. What of the veterans who say that the suicide rate is because of the way they're treated and ignored and obstructed by DVA? That's so interesting. Yes, I haven't spoken to any of those. There's actually a book that has just come out, and I have just started reading it, that's about Vietnam War veterans returning from the war by Peter Yule. And I think that I can't say for sure because I'm only sort of a third of the way through the book, but that would be an interesting one to read. I think that's going to talk about that a lot, and I'm really looking forward. The contemporary veterans. Yeah, because I haven't spoken to those veterans. I know that that's out there as well, but I can't speak to it because I don't know exactly. I'll have a look. I'll have a look, Bronwyn. I've had some association with people who are in the military now, but I'm reluctant to say anything definite. The Royal Commission, and I think that their pressure really pushed the government towards making moves at the beginning of the year too, the military and the veterans. Yeah. Does the Anzac legend only reflect those who were strong and not those who suffered mentally? I think that that might have been answered by Anne's question at the beginning. It's not often directly connected, but it needs to be. You know, I think it needs to be acknowledged that this is something that happens when you're in such a high stress environment. And I really see that the military is making advances or taking steps towards acknowledging this a lot more. The federal government is taking steps towards acknowledging this a lot more, and that's positive. And hopefully ends up being positive for the soldiers too, or the veterans too. Effie, have you looked at the way POWs of the Japanese were treated by the REPAT and POW Compensation Committee? Oh, no, I haven't directly. Again, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam and Gulf War is going to be the subject of my next study, which I started working on. And so I haven't looked directly at that, but Christina Toomey's work is fascinating. In that case, she writes about trauma as well. Yeah. Who's at Monash? Christina Toomey is at Monash. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, there's 2 Q&As. Sorry. Oh, yeah, no, I've seen them in Q&A. Sorry. Christina, the shell-shocked returned man has been almost a standard trope in Australian Great War fiction since the 90s. Do you see problems with mythologized, universalized notions of trauma, or is that something we should welcome given the official attitudes towards martial masculinity? That's so interesting. It depends on what kind of image of the shell-shocked returned man is pushed forward, because that idea about the Vietnam veteran, like the Vietnam veteran is seen in this very, very negative sense because of PTSD and because of the fact that many soldiers went, I just remember that when I was putting my book together, I called a lot of the soldiers to get permission or wrote to them to use their books, their letters and diaries in my book. And I had some really fantastic conversations. And so many of them said, well, we had to leave the city when we got back home because, you know, and so because of that, there's these very negative things like that. There's a very negative picture of what a shell-shocked returned man is. So I do see problems with it because it doesn't admit that since war has existed, trauma from war has existed. And that's something that I think needs to be acknowledged a lot more openly and accepted. But this also relies on changing views towards mental health in general in society. So that's also a journey that needs to be taken. Did that answer your question, Christina? I hope so. Gabriella, thanks so much. What do you think the delayed response to soldiers' trauma tells us about Australian identity? Well, I think that it tells us, if we think about federation, we think about 1900, what does a new nation want to show? That they're strong, that they're powerful, that they can stand on the world stage, for example. So if then you're sending men off to war, which is, you know, there's a way to show our strength, and they're coming back traumatized, well, not all of them, but some of them are coming back traumatized. It tells us how the notions of trauma and what trauma does to a person, or the ideas towards trauma at that time and how it makes a person look, did not fit in with what they wanted Australian identity to be. And I think there's been a lot of that in by political and military authorities. And thankfully I can see changes in the publications that are being released by the military. But yeah, it tells us that Australian identity is a specific way, and sadly those soldiers didn't fit into that. Anne's just put in the comments that Al Thompson has a recent article exploring this. his work is fantastic on this matter. Definitely his book Anzac Memories is brilliant. His and Marina Larsson's books on the First World War are just excellent. Okay, I run out of questions now.
We have time for a couple more questions if anyone has them. I think one just came up in, not in chat, but I'll leave it for a moment. Otherwise, it's a very small question, but I wanted to ask you from the image that you had in your slide set of the Mont Park Hospital. What is hot air treatment?
Oh. It's so interesting. Hang on, there was another question that came up. Oh yeah. I'll just go. Oh no, I can't go to it. There were so many treatments that came up. That example that I gave of electrocution, I think I chose that because it was one of the most common ones that was used during the First World War, and it was used during the South African War. But hot air treatment was an idea that you could, it was sort of like, the way I saw it, and I still don't have like a complete understanding of it, that it's sort of sauna-like, but sort of like that idea of putting people in sort of domes, but some of the ideas that came up about how trauma could be solved were just, for example, in the late 19th century and until the First World War, many soldiers were using moral treatment, which was basically like educating people and making them work hard, which goes into that question that Gabriella asked about Australian identity, that we're hardworking, masculine people. So the best way to cure weakness or feminization is to make us more hardworking, like to make us do things that men usually do, and that will make us more of a man again. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sweat it out.
yeah, very strange. Christina's just asked a question about where, sorry, I'm leading this now. Sorry, I'm just taking over.
No, absolutely. This will need to be the last question. But
yeah, so where's your research headed next? So yeah, it's in those later wars. So it's Second World War, Korean War, Vietnam War, and Gulf War. So I'm going to look at the conceptualization of the traumatized male soldier, but in a more, with that idea, the cultural expectations of these men and how that impacted the way that politicians saw them, the military saw them, civilian psychiatrists saw them, and the public saw them. And I'm going to go until 1991, because of course from 1992 you have female soldiers coming in, and then you have LGB soldiers coming in, and then 2010 you have transgender. So that will be the next project. I think, yeah, peacekeeping, not specifically, but it'd have to be covered, but the aim is just to look at these major wars, but inevitably you have to look at things that happen in between too. I hope that answered the question.
I think it certainly did. Many things to look forward to, if not like the entirety of Australian War going forward. In order to wind up, I'll hand back over to Kay, but I just personally wanted to thank Effie for such a wonderful and thought-provoking paper, and for taking the time out of her day to do so, in particular when it's a busy week. So, but I'll hand back over to Kay now, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Anne. At this point, I also wish to thank a few people who made this event possible. Our guest speaker, Dr Effie Karageorgos, our facilitator, Dr Anne Holloway, Manager of Special Collections here at Monash University Library, and the Monash University Library's communications team for promoting and running this event, in particular Fawzia Janif. On behalf of the library, thank you all again for joining us this afternoon. We had close to 90 registrations, so it's a real privilege to be able to provide a platform to share such important research. And thank you once again, and have a lovely afternoon. Goodbye.